Good evening, everybody. It's Wednesday. Welcome into the Galactic Archive. For those who might be new, my name is Meshla. I am primarily an audiobook streamer. I write and read Star Wars fanfiction and have been doing so for about 25 years. I also alternate between streaming some Star Wars Old Republic when I feel inspired to do so, usually every other Wednesday. General shenanigans, sometimes some ops, just silliness. Anyway, welcome in. This evening we're going to be starting in on a series called A Daughter's Quest, and the first story of which is a really long phrase in Mandoa, and I can try and pronounce it if you like, and I will translate it for you. I did talk about it a little bit on Sunday during the writing workshop. Give me just a second, I can pull it up for you. It is a mouthful, and I will probably butcher the pronunciation, but I'm going to try anyway. Alright. Okay. So this story is called Ke Bajrir Gar Ade Jagish Ade Kotla Adalish Ade Kotla Shia, which translates as train your sons to be strong, but train your daughters to be stronger. For timeline purposes, this begins before the events of To All Things and End. So yes, I'm reading slightly out of order. I didn't realize that until I was getting ready to read or continue Age of Darkness, actually, and I started doing some looking into the different stories and found out that I was actually reading out of order. So we're backtracking a little bit to start this series. This story focuses primarily on Marin Durza, who is a character that I created, and has some other characters that you might recognize from the other stories. So let me get stuff sorted over here. Oh my goodness. Trying to dual screen and it's been a pain. Alright. Okay. Yep. So this story, like I said, does begin before the events of To All Things and End. It takes place during the, well, it says, yeah, let's just go with it starts before To All Things and End. So yes, I'm reading out of order. Let me get some water before I get going. But regardless, welcome in. I hope everybody's having a good week. It's Wednesday, and the weather up here has been absolutely gorgeous. It's October, and it's supposed to be like 30, 40, and it's been like 70 during the day, so I'm enjoying that while I can, because normally this time of year it's quite cold. So, alright. Okay. Just trying to get my levels sorted here. Give me just a minute. Also, closed captioning is a thing. I just reminded myself to turn that on. There we go. Should have turned that on 5 minutes ago. Oh well. Yeah. Live and learn, I suppose. I need a checklist or something, like, right here. I really do. Alright. Oh my goodness. Here we go. Chapter 1. The night air was cool and damp against Marin's skin as she crept away from the orphanage. The dilapidated building stood on the outer edge of Coronet, Corellia's capital city. She hated that place. She couldn't do anything, and she had to keep hiding her talent, passing it off as accidental. With a muttered curse in Huttese that would have made her fellow orphans snicker, she tripped over a pile of garbage in the dark alley. Picking herself up, she continued towards the spaceport. She might get lucky and be able to stow away on one of the many ships that she saw coming in and out. Her growling stomach distracted her from that thought for a moment. With cautious, quiet steps, she skulked past the night guard, distracting him long enough for her to slip inside the perimeter fence. The question now was, where to look for food? The ship landed in the bay that it was assigned to with relative ease. To the average eye, the lines gave it the look of a vessel that no one would pay any attention to, or try to mess with if they knew the arsenal it contained. With everything shut down and the boarding ramp lowered, the pilot walked down and looked around the bay. The place hasn't changed a bit, he thought, as he stretched his neck to the side and pulled up a holomap on his wrist computer, locating where he was supposed to meet his contact. I should get this over with and get going, he told himself, checking his blaster at his thigh and the shoto on his back as he started to walk out of the bay. Marin heard the brooded footsteps coming around the corner, and she froze, slipping into the shadows as she watched their owner, an armored figure, coming out of the bay that she was headed towards. Sithbon, she thought. That was too close. Marin watched him, waiting until he began to move away, and then she ducked into the bay beyond. She only wanted food. She didn't care where it came from. With cautious steps, she moved towards the ship. It looked old and worn, with rust spots spread over the paint in some areas. She chewed her lip nervously and approached the hatch, studying it carefully. Okay. There is... I actually have some words that are technically supposed to be in another tongue, but I don't know Huttese, so it's like in brackets because it's supposed to be translated. Your target moved to the Selonian sector a few hours ago, his contact told him in the cantina. The tracking beacon we were told about is no longer active. He is many things, but he is not stupid, the armored figure replied as he stood up and tossed a few credits on the counter to pay for his contact's drink. Traffic through there only happens through a few routes. It will be no problem tracking him down. Nice move finding that beacon, he thought to himself. He must be paranoid because I planted it myself. Marin studied the hatch for several minutes until she began to trace the circuitry in the force. Several minutes later, with sweat dripping down her back, she was rewarded with the hatch sliding open partway. She allowed herself to breathe and slipped inside the cool darkness, blinking owlishly as the lights in the area flickered on above. Shaking herself, she crept down the corridor, searching for the galley or even a crate of rations. He kept down the alleyway from the cantina, fully aware that two were following him. He made a few changes in his path through the markets, and still they were behind him. With a sigh, he ducked into yet another alley, which was thankfully deserted. Seeing an opportunity, his attackers ducked into the alley with their weapons drawn. The first was gunned down instantly. Before it even registered that their plan had turned sour, he grabbed the second by the collar and threw him to the ground. Before he could even get back up, he felt a sharp pain and cried out as the stranger drove his shoto into his shoulder. And you were following me, why? The armored man asked as he got nose to visor with his attacker. We were told to watch for a guy in armor, the alien muttered through the pain. Told to make it look like an accident. As if you could, he said as he withdrew the shoto and rewarded the alien for telling him the truth, with a swift death. Meanwhile, Marin had finally found her goal, the galley. With a groan, she slid to the deck, her head spinning from hunger. She sat there for a few minutes, breathing slowly to quell the dizziness before standing and rummaging through the storage unit. The first thing she grabbed was a ration bar. Tearing the wrapper with her teeth, she bit into it as she stuffed yet more into her pocket. With her pockets full, she began heading back towards the hatch. It was then that the back of her neck prickled. She knew that feeling. Someone was coming. With a muttered curse in Huttese, she launched the storage unit and made a mad dash for the hatch, hoping to lock it or even dash through. He felt the tingling as he reached the entrance to the hangar bay. There's someone here. He left his weapons holstered and started to walk towards the ship. Marin backpedaled, trying to close herself down as much as possible, hoping it would disguise her presence. She wasn't entirely sure what she was doing. She ducked into a side corridor, her left hand questing for the small folding knife she kept. She didn't have to use it often, but something about that man put her on edge. She crouched in the darkness, breathing slowly and hoping he wouldn't find her. He reached the top of the ramp, looking down the corridor as he stepped inside. He couldn't sense anyone, but that didn't mean they weren't still on board. You know how to hide well, he thought, as he studied the area and saw crumbs on the deck. They could only have been from one of his ration packs. He turned and closed the hatch, locking it down and placing a coat on it. I know you're still on board, he said as he stood there. If you are here to try and kill me, you picked a terrible spot to try. I do not take kindly to thieves either, so you better come out and come clean. Just my luck, Marin cursed silently, struggling to slow her racing pulse. She'd never been caught before, and she knew this time that she was stuck. She swallowed hard as she heard the hatch lock engage. She remained kneeling on the deck, slowing her breathing as much as possible. She continued there for a few moments, not daring to move, and then she rose to a crouch, dropping the remains of the ration bar by her feet, before palming her knife and moving further down the corridor. She knew she was delaying the inevitable, but she didn't care much at this point. At least being dead, she wouldn't have to deal with the hell that Coronet had become for her. He heard it, faint, but he knew he heard something hit the deck in the direction of the galley, and that was the direction he took, not with loud steps, but with the silent movements he always used to stalk. Marin moved carefully down the corridor. Why did I have to pick this ship? Mentally berating herself, she skidded around the corner, her pulse pounding in her ears as the adrenaline kicked in. She knew it was only a matter of time. Glancing wildly around the small room, she ducked around the corner, slipping into the small closet and closing the door as quietly as possible. You can't hide on this ship forever, he called again, feeling a sudden shift, and he focused even more on that part of the ship. You can play this game as long as you want, but you will still lose. The only difference between ending it now and later is that later I'm not going to be in the mood to ask questions. He kept moving down the corridor quietly, still feeling for a trace of the intruder's presence. Marin swallowed upon hearing that, and beads of cold sweat traced down her neck, her chest heaving as she tried to calm herself. He sounded closer now, much closer. She tightened her grip on the small knife, knowing it wouldn't do much good against his armor. Silently, she rose on the balls of her feet, pushing out of the closet and dashing down the corridor to her left and away from him. The closeness surprised him when the panel fell away, and he saw his intruder running down the corridor. A child, he thought? A child snuck on board? He immediately started after her and caught her by the arm not too far down the corridor. She spun in his grip and brought a small blade around as hard as she could, but the blade snapped when it hit the plate of his Beskar. He batted the broken handle out of her grip and gently but firmly pinned her to the deck. She was in tears now, and he took no actions against her. I will not hurt you, he told her, and he meant it. It was against his personal code to hurt children, but you will tell me who you are. Marin was shaking, and she looked wildly around anywhere but at him as she struggled in his grip. She shook her head violently at his question, squirming. I have already given you my word that no harm will come to you, he said as he picked her up and brought her into the galley and before sitting her down. He looked to where she had gotten into the ration bars and took a bottle of water before tossing it to her. They'll dry your mouth out after a while. Now, your name. Marin fumbled the bottle in surprise, barely catching it before it hit the deck. With shaking hands, she brought it to her lips and took a slow sip, her gaze locked on the visor of his helmet. After a moment, she spoke, though it wasn't much more than a scared whisper. Marin. Fear was coming off of her in waves now. He couldn't have that, so he removed his helmet and showed her the bearded face underneath. You need to calm down, he told her as he set the helmet down on the table. Your heart will pound out of your chest if you don't. Marin gulped and started coughing as she choked on the water she'd been drinking. I didn't mean anything by it. I'm sorry. She was frantic again, hiccuping as she tried to calm herself. He sighed and walked over, placing his hand over her head and sending a wave of calm in her direction. It took a few moments, but it finally started to take effect as he knelt and looked into her eyes. "Why come onto my ship?" he asked, quietly but firmly. She shrugged, feeling her breathing slow a little. His touch was oddly soothing, and it seemed out of place. She looked at the deck for a moment, nervously twisting her fingers. I was starving, and there wasn't any food at the orphanage," she whispered the last word and looked away. "An orphan," he thought as he heard the answer. "How long have you been alone?" Myrn swallowed. "I don't know. A year? Maybe 2? She hiccuped again, but slowly lifted her head, fidgeting nervously as she brushed her dark hair from her face. Her face and the rest of her frame were pale and somewhat thin. Though crude attempts at patching had been made, her clothes were tattered and torn, the stitches large and uneven. "You have spirit," he told her as he stood and started to assess her. "You show a talent for making yourself unseen. How long have you been able to do that?" She swallowed again, her eyes suddenly huge. "About the last year," she said nervously, eyeing him warily as if measuring her chances. "I don't usually get caught," she muttered. "There is potential here," he told himself as he pondered the situation. He sighed and thought more about it. "They had said it was about time I started training again," he thought to himself as he rubbed his jaw and looked her over. "She has talent and a definite force connection. This is the first time I've done any of that kind of training. I'll have to trust my instincts on this one." "Marin," he said as he got up, "I will ask you this, and I want your honest answer. Did you feel a pull to this ship?" Marin blinked in surprise and flushed, scuffing her feet nervously on the decking before she nodded. "Yeah, even after almost running smack into you as you came out of the landing bay." She finally lifted her head and looked at him fully, nervously chewing her lower lip. "You have talents that make you unique," he told her, "more than you might imagine. I can take you off planet, perhaps show you how unique you are and teach you, but, and I will warn you now, this will not be easy, far from it, and if you accept, you are in this for a very long time." He stood and started to walk into the corridor. "I'll wait at the boarding ramp for your decision. Take your time and decide carefully." Marin looked at him, her eyes huge as his words sank in. She watched his retreating form for a long moment before her gaze slid to the deck again. "Is he for real?" she wondered. She hadn't felt any ill will from him. She listened to his footsteps fade down the corridor and frowned. What did he mean by a long time? With a frustrated and confused sigh, she slid sloppily to the deck, tucking her feet under her as she tried to sort out her thoughts. There was something about him, almost a magnetic pull. She didn't even know what it was. For several minutes she sat there, turning his words over in her mind. To a 6-year-old, it sounded great, almost too good to be true. What's the catch? She thought. She rose stiffly to her feet and decided to ask. Slowly she traced a path back to the hatch with quiet footsteps appearing at his elbow. "It sounds too simple. What's the catch?" She was used to people taking advantage of her inexperience and her young age. "No catch," he told her. "There was no such thing as a catch along the Mandos path. Are you aware of what I'm talking about?" Marin shook her head, craning her neck to look at his face. "I don't understand," she finally admitted, frustration tinging her voice as she leaned against the inner edge of the hatch with a confused sigh, scuffing the toe of her boot on the worn decking. "I've asked your name without giving mine," he said softly. "Where are my manners? My name is Jarius Durza. I am Katani by birth, but of the Bevan clan of the Mandalorians." Marin blushed slightly. "Good to meet you, Jarius." Her voice was soft and a little timid. She chewed thoughtfully on her lower lip again. "I don't know where the talent for hiding comes from. I've just been able to hide and unlock things for the last year." She looked nervously away from him for a moment. "The abilities you speak of are like those of a person who can touch the Force," he told her, "such as the Jedi." Marin blinked again and looked up at him, her eyes wide. "I don't even remember my parents. All I remember is the orphanage and stealing to eat every day." She looked down and fidgeted with the ragged hem of her shirt. "I guess anything is better than here." "Then your answer is?" Jarius asked. "It's Yes, she said firmly as she pushed away from the bulkhead, hugging herself uncertainly. Very well, he said as he locked down the boarding hatch. I have a contract to finish on Salonia, and then we will leave the system and begin your training. Marin nodded, her eyes wide, as she fidgeted yet again. What should I do while you're finishing that? She looked up at him, her eyes studying his worn face. It had hard lines, but she had a good feeling about him. You're still hungry, he told her as he turned to the cockpit, and you need a fresh set of clothes. Go back and finish up in the galley. After my contract, we'll see about getting you the proper attire for your training. Yes, Jerry's, she said firmly, nodding as she turned away. His mention of food had set her stomach rumbling again. He seemed to know much about her without her saying a word. Maybe he was a Jedi like he'd spoken of? She pondered that thought as she found herself in the galley again. Peeking in the cabinet, she found some dried fruit and cereal. That would do for now. She ate in silence until she couldn't take another bite. She cleared her bowl from the counter before wandering down the left-hand corridor until she found a sleeping cabin. This one looked like it hadn't been used, so she slipped inside and flopped onto the mattress, asleep almost instantly. I'm going to get a drink. Also trying to not slouch. It's a bad habit. Alright. Chapter 2. A few hours later, Marin woke as a jolt ran through the ship. She was still getting used to the sounds and sensations aboard the ship. They'd landed. Salonia, from what Jarius had said. Scrubbing her face with her palms, she sat up and blinked. He draped a blanket over her. She smiled faintly and scooted off the bed, padding barefoot into the corridor. Might as well look for a fresher, she thought. It'll keep me busy while he finishes the contract. Looking around, she peeked into a few cabins until she spotted what she wanted. There were towels and some spare clothes, which looked like they might be Jarius' size, but they would have to do. She slipped inside and pulled off her tattered clothes, rifling through the stack of clean ones until she found one that looked like it would mostly fit. It was smoky in the dive when he walked in. His senses and the scanners in his helmet were live, going through the crowd to find the one he was looking for. It took a few moments, but he eventually located his target with a few others in the corner. You are difficult to find when you want to be, he said as he approached the group. I can imagine the number of credits you had to put out for a scanner that could pick up the tracking device I put on your ship. I gave you my offer, Durza, his target said in Huttese as his friend spread out a little. An extra 50% on top of whatever amount whoever put the bounty on me told you, his target said again. That's not the point, Jarius told him, keeping a wary eye on the man's friends. The point is, the bounty was placed on you because you were the one who set the bombs at the shelters in the Jordas system. The other faction wanted no survivors, and you were happy to take the money to make it happen. With a sigh, Marin rolled up the sleeves and legs of the coverall. It was still quite large, obviously meant for someone taller than her. She bundled up her clothes and dropped them into the recycler before slipping back into the corridor. It was quiet now. Jarius had gone. Making her way back to the sleeping cabin she'd been in before, she ran her fingers through her damp hair as she pulled her boots on. With that done, she returned to the galley, spotting the crumbs and the ration bar from earlier still on the deck. She chewed her lip in thought for a moment, and thought about it before she shrugged. She saw no harm in it, so she peeked into the closet where she'd hidden before, finding a small broom. She then swept up the crumbs and dumped them in the disposal before returning the broom and heading to her bunk to rest. So I have two options, then. Is that it? His target asked as he stood up. Leave in your custody to face them or face off with you now? Thinking that a Mandalorian's reputation will make me choose the first? I don't rely on reputation, Jarius told them, already seeing how the situation might unfold and planning his next move. And regarding your options, I will be honest with you. The bounty didn't want you alive. The man to his left reached for the blaster at his hip, as did the one to his right. They were the farthest ones out, on each side of him. He moved to the one on his left, dragging his arm forward as his blaster cleared and aimed it at the one to the right. The bolt hit the other dead center, and Jarius wasted no time to break the man's wrist and turned to slam his hand up into the man's nose, driving the bone up into his forehead. He could sense the others moving to action and pulled a dart from its hiding place on his right wrist and threw it into the throat of the next person. His target was already running for the door as his last friend drew a vibroblade and charged. Jarius turned and grabbed the friend's weapon hand with his free hand and pulled to his right. The move pulled the man forward, and his throat met with Jarius' right hand, split into a V that snapped the man's Adam's apple. His target was almost to the door when he loosed a stun net from the launcher on his left gauntlet and fired its center mass into the man's back. It wrapped around him and sent him flying through the doorway, and he landed hard on the permacrete of the sidewalk beyond. Jarius only shook his head as he turned his target onto his back with his right foot. "Did you think you could get away from me twice? Just do it already," he yelled. "They wanted something specific," Jarius told him as he pulled a concussion grenade, stuffed it into the man's mouth, and set the timer. He drew the man's attention to a holocam he'd planted earlier to send the feed of what would happen to the people who had given him the contract. That being done, he turned and started to walk away towards the spaceport. He didn't even flinch when the explosion went off, when he was a block or two down the street. And I'm going to stop there and get some water because we're about to be in an ad, so. I don't want to be reading in the middle of an ad, so. We have a 1.5-minute ad coming up in about 30 seconds, so please take the opportunity to have a stretch, grab a drink of water, grab a snack. It's an excellent time for that. Alright. And I'm just going to stretch here a little bit because I've been sitting all day and I'm sitting more, so. Okay. But we'll be back in about 1.5 minutes once the ad starts. Okay. Should start any second now. I apologize for the ads. They do help support the stream, so I am grateful for those of you who sit through them and hang out for the awesome story time. Very much appreciated. Okay. Well, it hasn't started yet, so maybe. Until it does, I'll see if I can read. Something jolted Marin from her sleep. It wasn't a sound, but something she felt. Cautiously, she reached out as she did often when tracking people chasing her. There we go. Yep. I thought so. So we'll be back in 1 minute and 20 seconds. I'm going to take a drink. But I do want to thank those of you who are here this evening. I very much appreciate you being here, and I hope you're enjoying the story so far. We'll be back in about 35 seconds. And while the ad is running, I'm going to grab my meds for later. I have another 15 seconds anyway, so. And we're back. Thank you so much for hanging out through that ad. I appreciate it. They do help support the channel. I'm gonna start again at the top of that section because I got rudely interrupted by the ad. Something jolted Marin from sleep. It wasn't a sound, but rather something she felt. Cautiously, she tried reaching out as she often did when tracking people chasing her. She felt death. But where was Jarius? She curled up under the thick blanket, drawing her knees to her chest. Was he? Or was he the one that had caused it? Those questions whirled in her mind, and she lay curled up still when Jarius found her. He entered the cockpit of his ship and typed in a few commands into the communications panel. "Confirm holo-transmission of the contract being completed," he said blandly over the channel. "We have confirmed," a voice on the other end of the call responded. "Transfer of the agreed-upon amount has been completed. We thank you." He cut the transmission without another word and began to walk down the corridor, noting that the little mess on the deck was gone when he reached the galley. On a guess, he went into the extra sleeping cabin and noticed that Marin was still lying on the bunk. He nodded softly and closed the hatch to head to his own cabin. She had heard his footsteps in the corridor. Quietly, she slid off the bunk and walked after him, tugging at his coverall. He turned at the tug and looked down at her. "Yes?" he asked. For a moment, she chewed her lip. "I felt someone die," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought maybe you had." She shrugged, having difficulty finding the right words. He nodded softly. "You are more attuned to the Force than I thought. Yes, there was a death." He knelt and looked at her. "It was a contract that I was tasked to complete, and it did involve killing someone." She stared up at him, her eyes huge. "It hurts. It made me want to cry," she admitted in a whisper, twisting her fingers nervously in her coverall. He took her hand and held it for a moment. "Death is just as important as life. You may be too young to understand it now, but you eventually will. Feeling a death in the Force is expected, but with the right training you can tune it out to where it doesn't affect you." Her small face creased into a frown. "What kind of training? You said something about Mandalorian training, too. Is that the same?" She carefully sounded out the long word, looking up at him. He was the first person who'd ever cared about her. "It will be a combination of things," Jarius told her. "Most of your training will be in the Mandalorian way, fighting with your hands and different weapons. There are other ways that I will teach you, such as the Katani way of moving silently and swiftly. Then there are some things that I will teach you that are of a special way, that of the Jedi." "I'd like that," she said quietly, curling her tiny fingers into his as she studied his face, almost as if searching it for something. After a moment, she seemed satisfied. "So, now what?" "As I said before, for your training you're going to need different attire. We'll return to Coronet just long enough to see about some items. Then we'll be leaving the system." She frowned and tensed briefly at the mention of Coronet. "Do we have to go back there?" She hated that place and had hoped never to go back. "What things?" she asked curiously, fidgeting and rolling up the sleeves of her too large coverall. "A proper size set of clothes, for one." He stood up and started to walk towards the cockpit again. "And you're going to need more than one." "At least it was clean," she said with a smile. After a moment's thought, she followed and slid into the empty chair beside his. She couldn't remember being on a ship and looked around wide-eyed, resisting the urge to play with all the colorful buttons. He looked at her expression and followed her gaze over the different controls. "Yes," he said as he started the engines, "you will also be learning how to fly and navigate." "Me?" She stared at him. "But I can barely reach." "Not now. All things will come in time." Marin just stared. For the first time in her life, here was someone allowing her to learn and explore, something she'd never been able to do. She studied the control board briefly before she tucked her feet up and turned to watch him, hoping she wasn't staring. He paid no mind, knowing she was curious about everything, as he brought the ship out of the bay on repulsor lifts before cutting in the sublight drive to take the ship into the atmosphere. Once the ship was clear, he brought it around to head for Corellia. It wouldn't take long. Marin watched him silently, her thoughts filled with the last day's events. Finally, she decided to ask him. "Jarius, what's so different about the Mandalorians? What does the armor mean and all that?" He smiled slightly. "Well, the Mandalorians are a culture of warriors. We live by a code called the Wrestle Nare, the 6 actions. These are what make us a person a Mandalorian. He thought for a moment and then recited them. Ibik Koyer Tevesalnare Kajure Baskargam Kajohai Mandoa Karnovo Alitz Ke Gatali Alitz Brelir Ke Badzuri Sa Mandoade Ke Shikemi Har Mandalore, which I'm going to actually translate that for you. These are the 6 actions: wear armor, speak Mandalorian, defend the family, help the clan to succeed, raise your children as Mandalorians, rally to the cause of the Mandalore. I have hover translations on in my story, so it's taking a little bit of work. But I felt it was better to do it that way than have brackets everywhere. As to the armor, Beskar itself, to us it helps to remind us of our ancestors, the Tong. They were the original Mandalorians. It's also a tool and a symbol of one's family. He pointed to the sigil on his left shoulder plate. That is the symbol of my clan. And then he grinned. Not to mention, it gives us a bit of mystique. The Arutise, non-Mandalorians, are afraid of us because of the armor and the reputation my people have. Merrin stared. Well, I was certainly scared when I saw you, but I know better now. Will I get some armor too? In time, he told her. But it is something you earn. When you have, with my supervision and assistance, you will forge it. This way it is made for you, and only you. In time, everything you carry will be items that play to whatever their strengths are. That makes sense, I guess. There's no use having something if it's just there. Might as well be useful. She leaned back and pondered that for a moment. It sounded complex. When she looked up again, she saw that they were approaching a planet. Corellia, she assumed. We'll be in Coronet City in a few minutes, he said. We won't remain long, however. Should I go change into other clothes? I guess I look a bit silly wearing something this big. She flushed. At the time, she'd only wanted something clean. He tapped the side of his helmet. The helmet's not just for show. The built-in scanners recorded everything I needed, and I can move faster on my own. She grinned a little. That's useful, I guess. I can stay here. I'm still tired. She didn't mention that she was still adjusting to be around him, but she figured that he could probably guess. Give me just a second here. Give me 1 second here. Checking something out. Okay. Sorry for the loud clickies. My mouse. Okay. He returned a short while later, a duffel over his shoulder that he gently set down on the deck. These will work fine, he said as he closed and locked down the boarding ramp again. It's heavy, but you should be able to take it into your cabin. She raised an eyebrow but nodded, and after a moment hefted it experimentally. It was heavy, for sure, but she took a cautious step once she got her balance. With a nod and a quiet thank you, she hauled it into her cabin, dropping it on the deck beside her bunk with a sigh. She then sank to a cross-legged position on the deck, unzipping it, and it was almost as big as she was. Her eyes widened in surprise as she began pulling items from it and laying them on the bunk and the deck around her. There were several sets of clothes, which included 2 tunics and skirts, a few coveralls, 2 pairs of boots, a sturdy belt, some small knives that looked like they could be hidden easily, and several other items, some of which she wasn't sure what they were for. Grabbing a pair of boots, some underclothes, and one of the coveralls, she quickly changed before putting the rest back. Then she made her way back into the corridor, looking for him. Now you look presentable, he said from the cockpit as he started warming the engines to prepare to leave Corellia. Have a seat in the co-pilot's chair. How much do you know about things outside of Coronet? Give me just 1 sec here. Okay. Silently, Marin slid into the empty seat, chewing her lip and drawing up her knees. Not much. Coronet's all I can remember. She shrugged apologetically and ran her fingers through her dark hair. He nodded and thought about how to start her education and training. We can begin with the basics. Of all the galaxy's powers, only a few are the most important. Are you aware of these? She frowned, thinking. She didn't know much except for what she heard in the occasional news broadcast or from people in the market. I don't know a lot about it, but I've heard the Republic mentioned a lot. Yes, the New Republic is the largest influence. Second would probably be the Imperial Remnant. I don't know much about them. I've heard more about the Republic, with occasional references to the Jedi. He nodded as he piloted the ship out of the system, entering in the coordinates for the first jump. After a few moments, he pulled the lever and watched the lines start to form as they entered hyperspace. So where are we going now? She brushed her hair out of her face and watched the star lines momentarily as she turned one of the small knives over in her fingers. Home, he said, as he looked over the systems and then glanced at her. Be careful, Marin. They are not as sharp as we will make them, but they are still sharp enough to do damage. She nodded and put the knife away. She looked up at him. I know. I taught myself how to use a knife when I was 4. I had to. She turned her left palm up and showed him a faint scar across the inside. Had to learn the hard way. He looked at the scar for a moment. You'll learn more, was all he said. Marin flushed slightly before pulling her hand gently from his grip. She still felt that Jarius was being distant, but something told her that maybe that was how most Mandalorians were with people they didn't know well. You said home. Is that Mandalore or Catan? She asked after a moment, looking back at the stars. One of Catan's colony systems, Tanagas, he said as he pulled a hollow map of the galaxy up on his console, highlighting the area labeled as Catani space. The outermost planet. It's forested and habitable, but not used. Most of the colony's commerce and activity are on the inner planets. We'll be safe there. Her eyes widened. So, it's just going to be us? He nodded. Sometimes we need to do business with some of the inner planets, but we will remain on the outer planet of Tanagas. Other than that, there will be times when I will be called upon for a contract somewhere in the galaxy. You may come with me or continue practicing independently, depending on what is involved and how your training is progressing. That's a lot of space, she said, hesitantly smiling. I always liked exploring, I just didn't get a chance to much before now. She frowned. What kind of contracts? Are they always bounties? You'll be able to explore. In fact, it will be part of your training. And no, they're only sometimes bounties. There are calls for temporary protection, training, and some for assassination, but those are few, and I do not accept many of them when they come. So why the Salonia one? She asked, looking at her hands. For her 6-year-old mind, it was hard to reconcile the fact that he was gentle and caring yet capable of such things. He sighed softly. That one was a special case. There had been a civil war on a planet on the extreme edge of the Outer Rim. One of the factions hired the man I was after to plant explosives in the shelters that were taking in refugees from the other side. When it was revealed what had happened, the other side quietly placed a bounty on him and requested that I be the one to take it. She frowned. I felt him die. He nodded again. That would be the Force talking to you. But how could I be sensitive to it? I don't even know who my parents were, or if they were Jedi. She sighed and drew her knees up, resting her chin on them. One does not need to have Jedi as parents or even have Jedi in the family for them to feel and touch the Force, he told her. It chooses who it wills to be able to be sensitive to it. Not all who have the ability are Jedi either. I suppose that makes sense, she said softly, looking at the forward viewport. She was silent for a moment. So, what kind of stuff will I be learning first? A little bit of everything, he told her, not just things related to the way. She smiled and then looked thoughtful for a moment. I don't know if I have anything else I need to do before we get there. There's a holopad in the galley with basic materials already loaded, he said. The ship can handle itself, or we're in hyperspace, and it will take an hour to reach our first waypoint. We won't be home for several more. Well, I guess I'd better start reading then, she told him with a smile as she rose and surprised herself by slipping her small hand into his. Something about him told her that she could trust him. Okay. I'm gonna grab a drink of water. If you see me shrimping, please tell me to stretch. Channel commands are your friend. Alright. Yes, I am notoriously bad about slouching, so please, if you see me doing that, tell me to stretch. Chapter 3. Here we are, he said as she entered the cockpit several hours later. He had just brought the ship out of the last hyperspace jump and entered the system. The Tanagas system, outermost of Gatan's colonies. Marin slid into her now customary seat, staring at the mottled green and brown marble of the planet below. Hesitantly, she poked a few buttons on her console, trying to bring up information on the planet. "Panel on your right," he told her. She blushed. "Sorry," she said softly, hoping she hadn't accidentally activated the weapons or something. She chewed her lip thoughtfully for a moment, studying the indicated panel and slowly typing in her request. He looked to see which console she had touched earlier and made some minor adjustments. "No harm done," he told her as she punched in her request. "It would have just made the cabin a little bit cooler." She flushed in embarrassment. "Sorry," she said again. "I haven't had much experience with computers before." "Eventually, you'll learn everything about the ship and know your way around a computer. It will take time, but you will." Marin nodded, nervously chewing her lip for a moment as she watched the mottled marble of the planet grow more prominent in the forward viewport. "So, what happens after we land?" "There is another room there that you can use for your own," he told her. "There's a sparring area in the hangar and a firing range where you'll learn your blaster weapons. Also, we'll travel to other areas around the planet for different parts of your training." "I get my own room again?" Her tone was breathlessly excited. After a year or so, she enjoyed the space, sharing a dormitory with other orphans. He looked at her, noting her excitement and understanding why. This was all new to her. She could barely sit still, and after a moment she decided to gather the duffel he'd given her the day before. It didn't take too long for him to settle through the atmosphere and start heading to the hangar, covered and concealed by the growth and trees that covered the area. After a few minutes, they were inside, and he started to power down the engines. She felt the ship settle, even though it was gentle. As soon as she knew they were down, she headed towards the hatch and waited for him, the duffel balanced carefully on her shoulder. He walked into the corridor, his duffel in hand and helmet back on. Without a word, he unlocked and lowered the boarding ramp so they could exit. She followed him, looking around at the lush forest beyond the hangar as her feet touched the permacrete. For a moment, she just stood there, inhaling the crisp air. And then she looked up at him and slipped her hand into his. He noticed this and looked down at her. Probably the closest thing she's ever had to a father, he thought, as he nodded and closed his hand around hers to let her know. Through the door, last left down the hall. With a nod, she made her way from the hangar, following his directions. He watched her go down the hall and headed to his own room, settling his bag on the bunk. He then moved to an old wooden casement that stood against the wall and opened the door, taking his helmet off and putting it on the shelf at the top of the cabinet. With a sigh, Marin sank onto the bunk in her room, noting the neatly folded blankets and sheets on the end of the bed. Sheets. She'd never had any. With wide eyes, she pulled the stack to herself and ran her fingers over the soft fibers. After a few moments, she set them aside and dragged the duffel onto the bed, sorting through it as she began to put her clothes and other things away on the shelves that she could reach. Grunting, she then sat down on the edge of the bunk and pulled off her boots, wincing. They'd pinched her toes, but she hoped they would form to her foot before too long. There had even been towels in the duffel. She grabbed two and ducked into the fresher she spotted along the back wall of her room. With a grin, she noticed a second set of controls at a height that she could actually reach. She pondered for a moment what that could mean, but then shrugged, pulling off the coverall and dumping it in the laundry before she turned on the water. Heading back into the hall, he started to hear the sounds of a shower starting, so he headed into the living area and sat down at the computer, before logging in for a moment and checking his accounts and messages. He then logged out and went to the kitchen to start making some bihat, which bihat is roughly equivalent to, I don't know, green tea. It is an herb used in beverages, mildly antiseptic and stimulating, which makes me think of green tea. Perhaps chai. Could be either one, but more inclined to think it's green tea. Marin stood under the hot water for several minutes, letting it wash the grime off her skin and relax her muscles before she turned it off and padded back into her room, pulling on a loose tunic and pants that had been part of what he'd gotten for her, along with her boots before she brushed her hair out and pulled it back into her ponytail. She hung her towels on a hook near the door and slipped out into the hallway, the smells of food drawing her towards the kitchen. "I don't know when the last time you had a warm meal was," he said as she entered the kitchen, just as he finished putting ingredients into the pot. "This'll take just a little bit." "I honestly don't know," she admitted quietly, slipping into one of the chairs around the table. Her cheeks flushed slightly in embarrassment. Mostly it was whatever I could steal. The orphanage didn't feed us much. He shook his head at the comment, stirring the contents of the pot as they began to warm. "If the Corellians put as much effort into their other programs as they do Corsic and their defense force, it would be completely different for you." He checked the pot, grabbed 2 bowls, and put bread on the table before dipping some stew into each bowl. She shrugged. "I'm just glad to be away from there. So many of the others were scared of my abilities." She looked down at the table. He nodded again and set the bowls on the table before he sat down and reached for a spoon. "People have always been afraid of what they don't understand. Always have, and always will." "It was scary at times. When I first started manifesting my abilities, they kind of freaked out." Her left hand unconsciously slid down over her side, over a long scar that ran diagonally across her stomach, though it was hidden under her tunic. It caught his attention instantly. "Attacked because of it?" She nodded silently, looking down into her bowl's steaming contents. It sure smelled good, and it made her stomach rumble as she lifted the spoon to her mouth and took a bite. After a moment, she spoke. "I was 5, I think. Things just started happening. I couldn't control it at the time, and they freaked out. They came at me with a knife." She broke off, biting her lip as she tried not to cry. "Hence why you started to learn how to handle one yourself," he said, more statement than anything else, as he took some bread and started eating. "It's a handy weapon to know." She nodded. "It was my only option, then, and why I kept the knife hidden." "Until it broke on my armor," he said, half-jokingly. "Those I got you will do for training, but eventually we'll fashion you some that will be suited only for you." She laughed a little. "Well, I hadn't counted up on going up against someone in armor." She then smiled. "I'd like that. I think I have a talent for the knife." "There are many different weapons that you will learn." "I know," she said with a smile. "It's just the first that I learned, so I'm comfortable with it." She fell silent, turning back to her stew. It was delicious and filling. The meat had soaked up some of the broth, but it was still savory. She ate until she couldn't eat any more and was surprised to finally see the bottom of her bowl. "There's more," he said as he motioned to the pot. And we're doing a little bit of a time skip here. "You're used to the knives from the Coronet Streets," he said as they arrived in a section of the forest near the hangar. "But you've never picked up, much less fired, a blaster before, correct?" Marin nodded. "I've never used one before. Not even sure how they work, honestly." She tucked her shoulder-length dark hair behind her ears as she looked up at him. He pulled out a small holdout blaster, a good enough size to fit her hand. "The safety is here," he said as he knelt and showed her all the main points on the blaster, as well as the selector switch for stun and kill. "The rear sight is here, front sight is here. When you line it up, it should look like this." He held it at her eye level to see how they lined up. "With me so far?" "Mm-hmm." She nodded, reaching out with her small hand to locate each element as he pointed it out. When he held the blaster up to her eye level, she squinted, looking through the sight. A gasp of surprise fell from her lips. "Everything looks so big!" "It will for a while, because you're young," he said, with a chuckle. "They'll seem small later." "Okay, take the blaster in your hands. Do not touch the trigger until I say." She nodded and carefully took the blaster from him, wrapping her fingers around the grip and laying her index finger along the barrel like she'd seen him do. Slowly, she lifted it to her eye level again, nervously checking to ensure she'd pointed it away from both of them. He corrected her grip slightly to match what he'd always been taught. Remember the position. In time, it'll be second nature. Always keep your finger off the trigger until you are ready to shoot, and always grip it two-handed. Never use it single-handed unless necessary. Marin nodded, studying how he'd adjust her hand positioning. Why one-handed as a last resort? She asked. Two-handed gives you a more stable shooting platform, he said. And I said necessary. There will be situations where you'll need to shoot one-handed. She pondered that momentarily before she nodded, steadying her left hand with her right, and sighting down the short barrel. It did make it easier to see things through the sight. Okay, there's your target. 50 yards downrange, he said, pointing to a target he'd set up earlier. I'm not looking for center shots right now. I just want you to get used to shooting. All right. She adjusted her grip slightly, unconsciously spreading her feet as she sighted down the target he'd indicated. A bead of sweat traced down her forehead as she lifted the barrel, taking a slow breath before she squeezed the trigger. He pulled out a set of macro binoculars and checked the target. Good hit for your first shot. That's a good stance as well. Okay, keep firing. Nervously chewing on her lower lip, she nodded and adjusted her stance slightly, taking another slow breath before firing again. He was becoming more impressed as these two shots were grouped close to the first. Excellent. Now lower your aim just a bit. She frowned, sighting along the barrel as she studied the target once more. After a moment, she lifted the blaster to firing position again, though not as high as before. Again, two shots found their way to the target before she lowered the blaster and wiped her forehead. He looked downrange with the macro binoculars and couldn't help but smile. Very, very good for your first try. Are you sure you've never fired a blaster before? Yes, she said. I didn't have access to one. All I could ever get my hands on was a knife. A past life, maybe, he said, quietly with a smile. Check your charge level. She noticed the power level indicator had fallen to about 75%. I've got about 75% charge left. That means you have about 15 shots, he told her. Do you want to put the rest down range? Marin shrugged, grinning a little. Why not? She checked where he was and adjusted her grip on the small blaster. She pointed it at the ground like she'd seen him do. Then she changed her stance and lifted the blaster, sighting down the length of the barrel. After a moment, she began firing, this time in groups of 3, until the charge was exhausted. Very good. Now, if you'll excuse me, he said as he holstered the blaster and popped up a fresh target. It's my turn to practice. With a nod, Marin stepped away from her spot and found a rock to sit on as she watched him. She noticed he set down the macro binoculars, and she picked them up, holding them to her face as she studied the target. He closed his eyes for a moment, relaxing. His left hand was a blur as it went to the custom blaster on his right thigh. As it cleared the holster, his left hand went to grip, and his eyes met up with the sights, keeping it lined up. As soon as the top of the sights reached the center of the target, he fired 3 shots in rapid succession. Marin gasped, almost dropping the macro binoculars. How would he move so fast? He holstered the blaster, waited momentarily, and repeated the action sequence again without breaking timing. He repeated the same sequence 3 more times until the charge was used up. Knowing how his shots were already lined up, he ejected the power pack from the grip and slammed another one home before he holstered the blaster again. Marin just sat there, staring. After a moment, she slowly opened up, and then she felt him. That was a massive shock to her. She'd never felt anyone that intense before, and even when she'd hidden on his ship, she'd been so closed down that she'd barely sensed him. You're not the only one sensitive to the Force, he said as he kept looking downrange. I am too. She just stared at him. It was a minute or 2 before she found her voice. I didn't know. Is that why you offered to take me off Corellia? He nodded. Part of it. With the ability to touch the Force comes great responsibility, like nothing anyone else who doesn't feel it will ever know. And I wasn't an ad, I'm so sorry. So sorry, I wasn't an ad. And the rest? She said, quietly, looking up at his face as she wrapped her arms around her knees. I don't know how I can explain it to you, he told her as he sat down. The Force lets one who can touch it do things that are considered extraordinary. It can be the way to doing great things or unspeakable horrors. So why offer it to me? I'm just a kid. The question was blunt, but honest. Growing up on the streets of Coronet, how do you think you would have ended up? Before she could answer, he asked a few more questions. Would you have known what the right thing to have done would be? Or would you have grown up thinking and acting only for yourself, leaving everyone else to their own? Probably more worried about just surviving, she admitted after a moment, looking down at her hands. But I've always tried not to hurt people, even though I was stealing to eat. Whatever comes into your heart, he told her, the Force can amplify it. There have been great people, and there have been those who are responsible for terrible things. Your desire to not hurt people when you've told me you've acted only in defense, that's important. And it reinforces that I made the right choice to offer you another life. Again, she nodded, thinking about that for a moment. She was glad she was away from that hell. There were some events in her past that she wished had never happened, but now she had a chance to move on. After a few minutes of contemplative silence, as much as a 6-year-old could handle, she stood. I'm glad you offered me a new life, Jarius. Her words were soft but sincere as she slipped her hand into his again. He held her hand for a moment. There was a purpose for our meeting on the ship. The Force works in mysterious ways, he told her softly. Let's go back inside and we'll cover some more things before lunch. Okay. She looked up at him, curling her fingers around his as they walked back inside. Can I help with lunch? I'm probably not the best, but it's a good time, then, he said as they walked inside the hangar. He went into a separate room, pulling the holdout blaster in its holster and placing them in the spot on the rack. After putting the power pack and his blaster into the chargers, he closed the door and secured it before heading to the kitchen. Marin was already waiting for him, swinging her feet back and forth above the floor from the stool that she sat on. She was still having to find ways to bring things to her own height. He smiled and pulled a pan out of the cupboard and started to see about ingredients for a simple lunch. Marin leaned against the counter, watching with interest. How can I help? There's a container of bunta spice on the rack behind you, he said as he started to warm the pan. It's labeled. Okay. Marin looked around and spotted the spice rack. Clambering quickly down from the stool, she pushed it over to the other counter and climbed up again, sounding out the words on the labels until she found the right one. She climbed down from the stool again and set it on the counter beside him. He nodded, making another mental note of things to teach her. One of the things that I was told when I started learning has helped me out, he said as he sprinkled a little of the seasoning on the meat before rubbing it in, is that you want to be careful with how much seasoning you use. Too much, and you overpower the taste of the meat. When done, he put it in the hot pan to start cooking. And if you don't use much, it can make it bland, she asked, pulling the stool back over before she perched on it again, watching as he worked. She made a face when she mentioned bland food. It can, he said as he flipped the meat to cook the other side. It always depends on what you're cooking. Marin chewed her lip and thought, I'd never really had meat before until yesterday. Mostly it was just porridge at the orphanage or fruit and veggies that I could swipe easily. It's a good source of energy, along with some other things, Jarius told her. After he finished with the meat, he removed a package of vegetables and put them in the pan to sear. She smiled. That stew you made yesterday was good. What was that? The vegetables are from one of the inner planets. I do some occasional trading with them from time to time. All the meat is local wildlife. It was good, and I wasn't hungry later, she said. You've been used to what they have at the orphanage, which probably isn't even enough to fill a given, and they don't even have to eat. That made her giggle, but he was right. It always left me hungry, and I always felt tired after. Later, you'll be able to get an idea of what will keep you going for a while. He finished searing the vegetables and split them with the meat onto 2 plates, reaching over to grab some bread. Climbing down from the stool again, she pushed it back to the island before she went to the table. That smells good, she admitted, her mouth watering in anticipation. Just as simple as it can be, he said as he put the plates on the table. A simple meal can be the best, or so I've heard Lady Card say once anyway. Who's that? Merrin asked, frowning slightly. That's right, he said, remembering she was new to many things. There is a Jedi family on Catan, which is the homeworld of this colony system, and several others. The family's matriarch has shared recipes over the local net. It's one of her sayings. They are a well-known family to just about all Catani. She nodded. It sounds like she knows her cooking. When he set the plate in front of her, she had to bite down to resist the instinct to dive in. She took a slow breath and began eating slower than her instincts wanted her to. Slow is good, he told her. You eat too fast and you feel sick. Merrin flushed. Sorry. He made a sign of it being all right and started eating as well. And that is the end of chapter 3. Actually, I'm doing pretty good time-wise. Yay! As always, if you guys have questions, comments, or want to know anything about the story, if I'm using words that are unfamiliar to you and I have not translated them, please feel free to ask. You can just type the question in chat or use the translate command, which is !translate. But please feel free to ask questions in the chat if you're new. I'm always happy to answer them. Alright. Chapter 4. Show me your grip again, Jerry said as she stood with one of the knives in her left hand. Take your stance like this, he told her, as he stood beside her, keeping his feet apart a certain distance and his hands in the correct position. It's a general stance where you can either go on the defensive or offensive easily. Nodding, Merrin tightened her grip around the knife, adjusting her feet as best as she could. She wobbled for a moment until her balance settled. It might take a moment, but you'll get used to it, he told her. From this, you can easily counter any move that's used against you. This goes for unarmed combat as well as armed. She thought about that. If you hadn't had your armor on the other day, could I have actually hurt you? He smiled. You probably could have. You did surprise me, and had I not had the armor on, you could have done some damage. She was quiet for a moment. It was instinct after having lived on the streets for so long. And a good one, he told her. Your instinct, as well as your training, will help you greatly. With the Force, you can anticipate your opponent's moves, defend, and counter faster than they'll expect. But how? Like I was able to track you? Exactly. Extend your senses out, and you'll be able to get a feel for your opponent. In time, you'll be able to anticipate their moves and respond quickly enough. You will surprise and even intimidate them with this. She frowned, concentrating. It was the same as before, but this time she reached further. Her face was contorted in a frown of concentration. She felt Jarius next to her, but also other pinpricks. The creatures of the forest, maybe? Good, he said softly, keeping tabs on her concentration. Right now you'll feel many things. With practice, you'll be able to single out certain ones. Merrin nodded. You feel brighter, but I can feel other pinpricks too. The animals? He closed his eyes for a moment. It would seem so. Strange. They've never come this close before. Your presence attracts them, perhaps. Should I be worried they're so close? She asked with concern as her thumb traced the tool hilt of her knife. And we're going to do a little time skip here. Okay. Jarius opened a cabinet in the armory and pulled out a bottle of oil and a rag. He then went to pull out a long section of wood and a section of specialized string. Without saying much, he dabbed a small portion of oil on the rag and began to wipe the wood down from one end to the other. Merrin watched intently, not saying much. She got the feeling this wood had meaning for him somehow. She tucked her feet under herself on the bench that ran down the middle of the room. What's that? She asked, pointing her chin towards the wood he held. An old Katani warbow, he said as he finished oiling the wood and took a loop on one end of the line, looping it around the wood he held in his hand. He set that on the floor and grasped the other end of the string. Carefully, he put his right leg between the bow and string, bending the wood until he could loop the other end into place. He gripped the bow, then, pulling the string back as if he was fixing to fire, brought it back to rest slowly, and then repeated it a few more times to test the draw strength. "What's a bow?" she asked, screwing her face up a little as she watched him curiously. He chuckled softly. "It's an old weapon of war, a long, long time before blasters were even thought of," he said as he pulled a quiver out of the cabinet. "These shafts are arrows. You can see the tips at the end." He pointed to where a broadhead was at one end of the arrow. "And you aim those with the bow?" "Aye," he told her. "You place the arrow on the bow and knock it on the string like this." He showed her as he set the arrow into place. "You grip the string, one finger above the arrow and two below." Again, he demonstrated. "You take the bow and hold it at arm's length and pull the string till the arrow knock touches your cheek, or comes close. The aim is slightly different than most would think, and you fire by releasing the string. Depending on the bow and the string, you could hit something from a good distance away." She thought momentarily, comparing it to the blaster and the knife she'd learned a few months back. She'd gotten good with both. Would it be quiet like the knife? The blaster, I could hear the safety turning off. Very quiet. But this isn't used for contracts. "It's not? Why?" "We're going to need some more meat soon," he said, as he put the quiver over his shoulder. "Katani tradition says that no modern weapons are to be used for the new... Katani tradition says that no modern weapons are to be used for the hunt." Marin tilted her head sideways, studying the bow for a moment. "Will I need to bring anything?" "Only your knife," he said, as he hung his weapons belt on the rack and checked his vibroblade on his left hip. "Ready?" Marin nodded and stood, checking the small knife attached to her own belt. It was about the length of her spread fingers. She tugged momentarily on her boots and wiggling her toes. "Now I'm ready." "All right. We walk softly and carefully. If you need to talk, do it very quietly." They walked out of the weapons room and into the hangar before taking the trail away from the house. He looked up and closed his eyes briefly, stretching his senses to feel what was where. "South," he said as he opened his eyes and started walking down the trail in the right direction. Marin frowned momentarily, reaching out as he had done. She was still hesitant when doing so, but she was getting better at distinguishing the animals. He was right. The local wildlife was concentrated in that direction. She followed close behind him and kept her left hand near her knife, continuing to taste the pinprick presence of the animals. He kept the trail, walking slowly, looking around for sign, and started seeing it as they reached an opening along the cliff face, heading down towards the river. "Several have passed through here," he whispered to her as he pointed to the sign, scrapings along a tree just near the entrance. Marin looked where he'd pointed and saw the faint markings. She studied them momentarily and stuck her finger in her mouth and wet it, holding it to test the wind. "Wind's coming from the west," she said after a moment. "They're down along the riverside," he told her as he started to look and see the direction. "They went west. The wind will work in our favor in this case. We'll stay on the cliff. Quiet now. We don't want to spook them." He picked a line through the trees and drew an arrow to set it into the bow before walking through the trees along their path. With a nod, she carefully followed in his footsteps, stepping where he did. She wasn't entirely successful, and she cursed silently as she stepped on a twig and it snapped. "Sorry," she mouthed. He paused, nodded slowly, and looked down along the riverbank as he listened. He could hear a faint rustling further down the river. Marin bit her lip, trying to slow her pounding pulse. Her cheeks flamed with embarrassment, and she sank into a crouch, knowing they would probably have to wait it out. He crept up the trail very slowly, cautiously placing his feet on the ground, his eyes keeping watch down the riverbank. He could see them just at the water's edge for a moment. Several had stopped for a drink, but one, a trophy-sized stag from the looks of him, had his head up and looked back up the river that they had just walked down. "He's suspicious," Jerry thought as he stayed still. Marin stayed crouched, watching his progress in the gathering twilight. She, too, could sense the jolt of alertness. She drew her knife, holding it ready with the blade pointed behind her and towards the ground. Jerry's edged a little closer. The trophy was the one he'd chosen to take, and he kept his eyes on it as he moved closer. He spotted something. he thought as he stayed perfectly still. Patience was going to win this contest. Still, Marin waited. She didn't want to screw this up. Not now. They needed the meat. Her stomach rumbled quietly in protest at the thought of a purely bread and fruit diet. Biting her lip, she stayed where she was, watching and learning from what Jarius was doing. As if the creature had heard it, the stag turned at a dead run, as fast as he could. Towards us, Jarius thought, as it passed the place he was crouched. What luck! He took off in a flat run, passing Marin as he kept his eyes, as he switched his gaze between the stag and his path. He kept both hands on the bow, while running hard along the cliffside. Marin gasped silently. She felt the shift. It was as if it had been a summons. She rose on the balls of her feet, gripping her knife in a backhand grip. She could feel the buck moving closer, and Jarius alongside it. Waiting for a few heartbeats, she was poised on the balls of her feet. She lunged when she felt the buck passing her hiding place, and felt her knife sink into the hide and slice cleanly through her tendon before she backed away. He kept pace with the buck, looking ahead to see that he was running out of cliff very soon. They sloped downward and met the riverbank, but it wasn't a good grade to keep running. He kept switching back and forth, seeing where he would have to make his move. His senses were wide open now, taking in every ounce of energy, every sight and scent. This was the moment Akatani lived for. He took a running leap off the cliff face, pulling the arrow back as far as possible while he was still airborne. It was as if time had slowed to a crawl as he lined up where he pictured the stag would be and held it there for a moment before releasing. It sang as the arrow flew through the air, straight and true as it went right where he wanted it, hitting the stag in the prime spot just behind the shoulders. The force of the strike and the ultra-sharp broadhead power caused the animal to stumble and fall. It hit the ground when Jarius's boots did. He moved forward into a roll, using his hands to flip over and landing on his feet as he took some deep breaths. Then he started to slow his breathing and pulse. Now that he was close, the size of the stag amazed him. I've never seen you along these trails before. Amazing. Marin watched, dumbfounded, as Jarius took down the stag. She clutched her bloodied knife and crept closer, spotting where she'd slashed and hamstrung it, and had still been able to make the jump. We are sorry to kill you, brother, Jarius said softly to the stag as he walked up to it and crouched. He pulled the arrow from its hide and wiped the blood on the fur before he put it back into the quiver. Setting the bow down, he drew his knife to begin the work. For a long moment, Marin sat on her heels, watching. She felt drawn to reach out and touch the fur with her fingers as she felt the animal slowly die. And she whispered something softly as Jarius began to work. And that's the end of chapter 4. Let me look at chapter 5 real quick. Maybe. Let's see. Maybe? What do you guys think? Should I go for chapter 5? It's only 8:30. I could go for chapter 5. What do you guys think? Chapter 5. Should I stop here? Should I do chapter 5? What do you guys think? Okay. All right. I'm gonna get a drink of water first, regardless. Oh, oops. Alright. You know what? I'm gonna do it. Give me one sec. Updating. There we go. Alright. These chapters are a little bit shorter than normal. If I'm reading too fast or using words that you guys aren't familiar with, please let me know. Alright. Chapter 5. Jerry's finished dressing the deer in the corner of the hangar he'd set up just for that purpose, with a tiled area that was easier to clean. With that done and the pieces cut, it didn't take him long to clean, sanitize the corner, and put the pieces in the freezer. Marin perched on one of the crates, watching intently. At first, she'd had a hard time and had to fight the urge to gag. She was calmer now. After a moment's thought, she followed Jarius to the freezer, leaning against the door's outer frame. Jarius, I meant to ask you. I noticed shower controls and other things set at the right height for someone my age. He paused at the comment, thinking about how he'd answer that before he finished putting the pieces in the freezer and closed the door. I wasn't always Mandalad, or a solitary bounty hunter, he said softly. I once had a family, a great love. He closed his eyes as he remembered it. They were taken from me. Marin bit her lip as she felt the grief well up in him for a moment. She hesitated and then tugged on his hand, pulling him down onto her level so she could wrap her arms around him. I'm sorry, I didn't know. I suppose I should talk about it sometime, he said as he held her for a moment. He stayed there before entering the living room and pouring himself a drink, and then sitting down in the easy chair. My wife was a pilot herself, working as part of a small civilian transport group between the colony systems, he told her as he motioned for her to sit down. She nodded and quickly sat on the floor in front of his chair, tucking her feet beneath her. So, what happened? She asked, wondering if that event had caused him to become a Mandalorian. Partially, he said as he sensed her thought and took a long drink. She was on leave, riding on one of the company shuttles to the medical center on Catan, carrying our unborn daughter. The shuttle left orbit and headed for the jump point to return to the Tanaga system when a bomb was set off in its cargo hold. That's awful! Marin's face showed her horror, and she slipped her fingers into his again. Who would do something like that? And why? I found out the who, Jerry answered. The why still escapes me. There is a group that carries out almost constant attacks against our people. When they first formed ages ago, they were mainly spies and assassins. Oops. Nowadays, they do everything for anyone who pays for their services. I don't know who paid for the contract or why, he continued, but I started on a rampage, trying to find everything I could. At the time, I didn't know about my ability with the Force, so I didn't know what was driving me further down a path I didn't need to take. It finally took a Jedi and a Mandalorian to find me while I was on my quest. They were able to confront me, show me what I had become, and they offered me a new path. He looked out the window. They knew that I was an ex-military man, and saw how it affected me, and both decided to train me. The Jedi taught me some of the finer things of the Force, how to use it in the way that I needed to. The Mandalorian took me under his wing and saw how similar I was to himself. He trained me in the ways of the Mandalorians, which combined with what I already knew from my time in the military. That made sense from what Marin knew of him, and she nodded. I admit I was pretty scared when I first saw you. It's why I ran. I've been unable to get over what it almost did to me, my quest for vengeance. It stays with me, especially if I'm out on a contract. It does worry me sometimes, but I'm surprised I've not felt it here lately. Give me just a second here. Do you know why? She asked directly, as kids often will. I was expecting and lost a daughter, he said quietly as she finished his drink. That's why your room is more set up for someone your size. I suppose that is another reason why I offered you this choice. Mandawad, that you consider adoption honorable and just as important as raising your own. She blushed. I'm honored that you gave me a second chance. Most wouldn't. I'd like to think that she would be like you, he said, his eyes becoming distant. And with all the training we've gone through, I practically consider you a daughter already. She blushed even more. She had learned a lot. From what she knew of the Mandalorians, they were proud but tried to help those they could. Vorentia, she replied softly, thanking him in the Mandalorian tongue. She'd been studying in her spare time and was glad she'd gotten the pronunciation right. He nodded and smiled. Your Mandoa and your Katani are improving. Come on, it's getting later in the day. Marin nodded and stood. Time for bed? She asked, hoping he'd say no. She enjoyed listening to him talk. His voice was soothing. So we're studying first, he said. I need to check to see if anything is coming up, and then I'll be right along. Okay. She nodded and moved down the hall to her room as she saw him head towards the terminal. She flopped down on her bed and left the door open as she pulled out her holopad that had her lessons. He powered up the terminal and entered his login to check for messages. One came up and he read it carefully. The message was different from what he'd been expecting, and it was from the Mandalorian who had taken Jarius under his wing many years ago. It was short and to the point. I heard a rumor that you'd picked up an Adik on your last contract. Suppose you can spare the time? I want to meet her. He nodded and smiled as he typed a response. You are always welcome here, my friend. Before you jump into the system, let me know so that I can give you a course heading. With that sent, he turned off the terminal and walked towards Marin's room. Marin lay on her bunk, engrossed in the datapad, slowly sounding out some of the longer Mandoa phrases. She felt him coming, but kept studying and waited for him to come in. We'll probably have a visitor coming sometime soon, he said as he slowly opened the door. A visitor? She looked up, setting down her datapad and looking up at him. That was odd. They'd never had a visitor here before. Who's coming to see us? She asked, hopping off her bed and almost bouncing excitedly. Believe it or not, the Mando that found and trained me, he said as he sat down in the chair. He heard that I'd found you and wants to meet you. Me? She asked in surprise. But why? I don't know. Curiosity, maybe, he said with a smile. He knows what I told you and knows how I was then. Probably to check on me just as much as to meet you. I'm going to stop there because we have an ad starting and I actually got it this time. Should be back in about a minute and a half. Oops.
Can you hear that or you cannot hear that?